and welcome to our third and final lecture on the history of the Qazaq Khanate. In this lecture, we are going to take a closer look at the internal political dynamics of the Qazaq Khanate, and we are going to pose a question of in what ways the political functioning of the Qazaq Khanate differed from other neighboring states and societies. We are not in this lecture going to take a sort of year-by-year overview of events within the Khanate. There are other sources we can recommend that examine this history in more detail if this is something that interests you. Rather, our objective here in this final lecture is, again, to take a closer look at the underlying political dynamics of the Qazaq Khanate and to examine how they differed in some very significant ways from neighboring societies. So I want to begin our discussion here by posing a very basic question. Can we consider the Qazaq Khanate to be a state? As some of you know, recently here in Kazakhstan, we celebrated the 550th anniversary of what is described as Kazakh statehood. And I want to interrogate this question a little more closely. Was this phenomenon of the Qazaq Khanate actually a state in the technical sense? What do we mean by a state? And is this a conceptual framework that applies to the Qazaq Khanate, or are there some other ways of looking at it that might help us to better understand the nature of this political unit? So we need to begin by understanding exactly what a state is. And in order to approach this, I want to return to the figure of the famous early 20th century German sociologist Max Weber, who was introduced in your first lecture by Professor Sirlampilov. Who very famously gave a definition of the concept of the state, which still broadly applies within the social sciences today. And there are a couple key elements to Weber's definition of the state. One of them is what he calls territoriality, that a state must control and define a specific set of territory on which it operates. It does not mean that the boundaries of the state do not change, that it does not contest with other neighboring states for increases of territory, but that it controls a defined space of territory in some way. The second is that a state must exercise authority. It must have the ability to exercise its political will throughout that territory that we define in the first part of this definition. So not only must it control a specific space of territory, but it must be in some way able to exercise its power and authority throughout the scope of that territory. A third important element here is legitimacy. And again, this is something we talked about in our first lecture, but I want to return to it here just as a refresher of what this concept actually means. Legitimacy is different from authority, power. Authority is the ability to exercise power. It is the raw ability to actually exercise power and authority over the people and institutions within the state. But legitimacy is what defines that authority as right. So not merely the ability to exercise authority, but the right to exercise authority. What it is that makes a state and the rulers of that state correct rulers. And there are many different forms of legitimacy, some of which we have already examined. But legitimacy can come through genealogy, through the ancestry of the ruler. Of course, in the case of the Qazaq Khanate, being descent from Genghis Khan. It can come from religious legitimacy. It can come from some other form of political or religious ideology. And many modern-day states obtain their legitimacy through democracy, through claiming, at least nominally, to exercise on behalf of the will of the people through popular elections. But there are many different forms that legitimacy can take throughout history. But a state must have some form of legitimacy. It's not enough to simply have power. You have to be able to prove why you have the right to that power in some sense. Another element that Weber defined as essential to the definition of statehood is what he calls a monopoly of violence. And what Weber means by this is that within the territory of the state, it is only the state and the agents of the state who have the right to use force to enforce the rules of the state. To put it in more blunt terms, who have the right to employ violence to enforce the rules or the regulations of the state. And if someone else were to do this, if someone else commits an act of force or violence outside of the regulations of the state, this is considered illegal. It's considered illegitimate, that only those working on behalf of the state or authorized by the state in some way are allowed to exercise force and violence in order to enforce the authority of the state. So this monopoly of violence, as he terms it, is another key element of the state. That if the state does not have the singular legitimate control over these enforcement mechanisms, then it becomes problematic to define it as a state. So the question that I want to pose here is, does this model apply to politics in the Kazakh steppe in the 15th and the 16th centuries, to what we can call here the Qazaq Khanate? So let's find out by introducing you to somebody here. This is a picture of my son, Sinan Biban, born in 2016. This is, of course, a baby picture. He's a bit older now by the time you're listening to this. But I want to ask you a question. Can you guess who we named Sinan after? And some of you may have guessed, he is named after a famous Ottoman architect who lived in the 15th and 16th century, Mimar Sinan. My wife and I did our honeymoon in the city of Istanbul, a very lovely city where we really fell in love with its architecture. So we decided to name our firstborn son after the architect of many of these beautiful buildings. Now, there's a reason why I'm introducing this name here, not just simply to show off cute baby photos, but because it is, in fact, of relevance for our discussion here. I want to talk about some of the great buildings that were constructed by Sinan. And I'm not talking about the Lego buildings created by my son, but rather by Mimar Sinan, whose picture we see on the right here. I hope you can see the family resemblance. Sinan, Mimar Sinan, of course, is responsible for the design and construction of many of the great buildings that were built in the city of Istanbul in the 16th century and elsewhere in the Ottoman Empire. Just two of them that I've put up here: the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, one of the largest mosques in Turkey and the world at large. The Selimiye Mosque in the city of Edirne in modern-day northwestern Turkey. Of course, these are only a few of the great mosques that he worked on. He was also involved in a redesign of the Hagia Sophia Mosque in Istanbul, among many other things. You'll notice some common features to all of these buildings, of these mosques that Mimar Sinan worked upon. The very imposing domes, the great minarets going far up into the sky. And this type of design of mosques, in fact, is one that became very popular throughout much of the Muslim world. Other examples here, up in the top left corner here, we have a very famous building, the Taj Mahal, in the city of Agra in India, built by the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan in the 17th century. In the top right, we have another mosque from Istanbul, the Blue Mosque, that was built a little later in the 17th century after Mimar Sinan. In the bottom left here, we have a very famous mosque from the city of Isfahan in modern-day Iran, known as the Shah Mosque, that was built during the time of the Safavid Empire, also in the 17th century. And then finally, at the bottom right, another mosque from the territory of India. This is the Juma Masjid, or the Friday Mosque, in the city of Delhi, in Old Delhi, which was also built under the Mughals. So again, we can see a lot of common features here in terms of the very large domes, the sheer size of the architecture, and especially these minarets soaring way up into the sky, which sort of evoke a connection between heaven and earth, which is intended on the part of the architects here. But in fact, it was not only Islamic architecture that had these sort of features and buildings that were being built. Two other buildings that were built in Russia in the 16th and 17th century. St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, of course, Kazan Cathedral. And we see here, again, even though these are Christian buildings, not Muslim buildings, some features that may be familiar to you. The presence of domes, again, these towering pinnacles reaching up into the sky. These buildings are statements. These are not simply places where one goes to pray. These are not simply functional buildings. These are statements of political power, statements of authority. And you can imagine the type of state that would be required in order to build a building of this size, of this magnitude. It would require an enormous amount of material resources, of human resources, of bureaucratic resources in order to plan and in order to plan the logistics involved in their construction. If we go back to the case of the Taj Mahal, it is said that there were 20,000 workers that were brought from all over the Muslim world, not only in India, but from the Ottoman Empire, from Persia, from Central Asia, that were brought together to build this building over a period of about 22 years. This requires a very strong, a very centralized and powerful state who can bring together these level of resources and money and people as a way of constructing these buildings. And again, these are not merely functional buildings. These are buildings that are meant to exemplify the authority, the power. We might even say the legitimacy of the regime. And it is not a coincidence that many of these are religious buildings. These buildings are intended also to evoke, again, a sort of religious legitimacy of the ruling regime. Based on the idea that just as there is one God above, there is one ruler below, and that present ruler, that his rule is in fact ordained by God. So the ideology of rule by divine right is one that was embraced by many of the states in this period. But here's a question for you. What about Kazakhstan? Can you think of any buildings like this that existed on the territory of present-day Kazakhstan in earlier times? Of course, in present-day Astana, we have some very large mosques that have been built quite recently. But what about in the period, let's say, before the 19th century? Can you think of any older buildings that fit this model in the territory of Kazakhstan? Well, one that might come to mind is the shrine of Ahmed Yasabi in the town of Turkestan, previously the town of Yasa, in southern Kazakhstan along the Sirdarya River. Um, Certainly, we can see many similar features here in terms of the domes, the style of architecture, but there's a couple problems here. First of all, this site was not built by Kazakhs. It was built by the Emir Timur in 1398, a figure who we discussed in our previous lectures, one of the rulers of the Khanate of Chagatai. And it's important to mention here that Timur himself did not actually commission the original building. We do know that there was a shrine here on site prior to that, but he commissioned a vast redesign of the building and expansion of the site, which is the building that exists today. But this building, it's not located on the steppe. It's located in one of the urban areas of southern Kazakhstan. So can we think of any examples like this within the steppe itself? I'll give you a minute to think. And if you haven't come up with any ideas, it's probably because, well, there really aren't any. Um, why are there so few buildings like this in Kazakhstan and none within the steppe region? We just simply do not have examples like this of what I've shown from previous slides of these large imposing buildings, really before the 19th century, before the Russian conquest on the Kazakh steppe. So why is this the case? Is it because Kazakhs were too lazy to build large buildings, or they simply lacked the skills or the capability to build large buildings? I would suggest that is not the case. That in fact, the reason why we do not find buildings like this within the Kazakh steppe is because of a different type of political dynamics that is at work there. And so I want to explore this question of political dynamics and how the sort of the nature of the politics of a state can inform the type of architecture that emerges from within it. The period of the Qazaq Khanate, we're referring here to the 16th, 17th, and to the early 18th century, is a period where throughout much of the Muslim world we see a number of very strong, very powerful states that emerge. Of course, the biggest and largest of these is the Ottoman Empire, which controlled not only modern-day Turkey, but much of the Arab Middle East, of northern Africa, Egypt, and for a period of time, areas of Eastern and Southern Europe as well. So one of the most powerful states in its period. To the east of there, covering the bulk of the territory of present-day Iran and Afghanistan, was the Safavid Empire, which came to power um, in the early 16th century and remained in power down to the early 18th century. And of course, to the east of this, covering the bulk of the Indian subcontinent, is the Mughal Empire, which, as you know from your previous lecture, was established by the Timurid ruler Babur after he was kicked out of Central Asia by Muhammad Shabani Khan. So these three empires together are often referred to as the gunpowder empires. Now, and I'll say a little more in a minute about why they are given that title. But it's not only in the Muslim world that we see strong centralized states that are developing here. To the east, in China, beginning in the mid 17th century, we see a very strong state come to power under the Qing dynasty that rapidly expands into the territory of Central Asia. We will talk in a future lecture and seminar more about the relations that develop between the Kazakhs and the Chinese. But again, another example of the sort of powerful centralized states that are developing in this period of the 16th and the 17th century. And of course, the biggest one of all, and one that would become of great significance for the history of the Kazakhs, is the Russian Empire to the north, which between the 16th and the 19th century undergoes an enormous process of expansion. And also, as we have seen, shows many similar features in terms of its political system, in terms of its architecture, with other centralized states in this period. So, as I mentioned earlier, these states collectively are often referred to by historians as the gunpowder empires. And I want to take a moment to explain why they are given this title of gunpowder empires. And as you can guess, the title itself comes from the type of military technology that is being used among these states. Now, of course, gunpowder did not originate in the 16th century. We know it was being used in China and elsewhere, going back even much further, much earlier than this. Gunpowder, in fact, was used to a somewhat limited extent by the Mongols during the Mongol conquest. It was used subsequently in conflicts in the 14th and 15th century within the former Mongol states. But really, into the 15th and 16th century, we begin to see some very dramatic developments in gunpowder technology, the development of new types of rifles, of very large cannons, for example. And these developments in military technology have some very profound effects on politics and on the type of states that we see developing in this period. Now, if we think back to the Mongol conquest, if you think back to Professor Selim Pilov's lecture on the Mongol conquest, one of the things that made the Mongols very effective as a military force is that virtually all, at least all male Mongols, already had the training and the equipment to commit warfare. Basically, they brought into the battlefield the same tools, the same weapons that they used in hunting. The Mongols themselves did not really have, until a later period, any sort of centralized armory or factories to develop weapons. Uh, People brought their own weapons with them into war. They basically, the weapons that they had within their home is what they brought into warfare with them. And this is part of what made them so effective, that they could simply rely upon the sort of skills and talents and equipment that they already had among their population. But as technology began to be more developed, increasingly we need more technical specialization in order to develop and use these weapons. You simply can't build a cannon in your backyard. You require special factories, special training to use it. And as you develop more specialized forms of warfare, this means that you have more and more of a standing army, people who become professional soldiers who are given special training and equipment to conduct warfare. Again, previous to this, the Mongols themselves did not really have a standing army in that sense. Basically, every male Mongol of a certain age was part of the army. And they would campaign for certain periods of time, and then they would go back home to their herds and their family. And then when there'd be time for another campaign, they would leave and go on campaign again. But increasingly, what we're seeing during the early modern period is the development of standing armies, of professional soldiers, a greater level of specialization and professionalization among the military. And it also means that for a state to command this type of expertise means that they need to develop more and more complex bureaucratic systems and administrative systems in order to train the military, in order to develop the weapons, in order to keep lists of who need to be paid, for example. So we start to see the development of more and more centralized and more complex bureaucracies, administrative systems, new forms of record keeping, of keeping track of money, of payments, of taxation, of rolls and registers of populations, of recruit into the military. So the development of new type of administrative and bureaucratic structures is also something that is emerging partly as a result of this increased specialization within the military. Along with this, another feature of all of these empires that we have discussed here is that all of them, again, have a centralized state structure, meaning they have only one single ruler. And succession to that position of rulership passes in a linear fashion, generally from father to son, in many cases to the oldest son, but in some other cases to a different son. Now, this does not mean that there would not be competition or conflict over the process of succession. It does not mean that rulers would not be challenged from without the family, that we would see new contestants coming and mounting challenges against the ruling regime. But what it means, why it's significant here, is that in theory, there could only be one single ruler of the state. We can only have one Russian Tsar. We can only have one Shah of Persia. There can only be one Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And if anyone else wanted to claim that position of Shah, of Sultan, basically they would have to get rid of the person who is currently holding that position, either by physically overthrowing them or killing them or getting rid of them in some fashion, leading a revolt. There could only be one ruler at one time, and succession to that position of rulership passed in a linear fashion through their family, to their descendants, again, at least in theory. And finally, we also see a very strong relationship between the state and religious institutions. And again, this takes us back to this question of legitimacy, that nearly all the states in this period, in one way or another, were looking to sources of religious legitimacy. For many Muslim states, for Christian Orthodox states such as the Russian Empire, working under the theory of divine rule, that just as there is one God above, there can be only one ruler on earth, and of course, God's favorite ruler happens to be that one who is in power at that moment. So this is what we see reflected in the choice of architecture here, in which these designs of these very prominent and imposing religious structures serve as symbols of political authority, but also symbols that ruler is God's chosen candidate, that they are working, ruling, and ministering God's people on his behalf. So, of course, this patronage of art and architecture as symbols of state power is a very big portion of this as well. Features of the gunpowder empires of the empires that are increasingly surrounding the Kazakh steppe in the 16th and the 17th century. So the question is, what do we see within the Kazakh steppe itself? And here it's clear that politics, society was operating in very different ways than what we see in neighboring societies. We do not see the sort of development of large-scale bureaucratic apparatuses that we see in other states. Among the Kazakhs, they are following a predominantly oral tradition. We do not see a tradition of record keeping, of a centralized administration or bureaucracy. We do not see an established pattern of linear succession. I have discussed this at some length in previous lectures. No big buildings. This is one consequence of this. When you do not have a centralized administration, when you do not have a centralized military, when you do not have this sort of centralized control over resources, it becomes very difficult to develop the resources that are necessary to build a big building such as this. Nor was it even necessarily considered necessary for Kazakhs to have these sort of buildings. Now, I want to talk about some of the reasons why the Kazakh steppe was different from neighboring societies. Again, was it because there was something deficient about Kazakhs, that they were not simply able to develop these institutions, or was there something more fundamentally different about their society? And what I would like to suggest here, there are, of course, many arguments that have been put forth to explain this difference. But I want to focus on one aspect here, which is an ecological argument. That this difference here is because of the nature of the environment of the Kazakh steppe. Now, you might say that naturally, what can account for these differences was the fact that the Kazakhs were nomads. That, of course, nomads don't have a centralized bureaucracy. Of course, nomads don't have big buildings. Um, well, that's certainly true, but in fact, it's not a very good explanation in of itself. Because if we look at many of these other neighboring societies, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, even the Qing Empire itself, have their roots in nomadic power. They were established by dynasties who were originally nomads. The one exception to this is actually the Russian Empire. But within the Islamic world and within China, virtually all of the states that we see emerging in this period actually have their roots in nomadic empire, were established by nomads. What is different is the fact that in all these other examples, the nomads, once they conquered these societies, and remember that as we've seen from previous lectures, nomads historically are very good at military activities, are very good at conquering other peoples. Um, what they are not necessarily so good at is administering them. Again, because nomadic societies do not have this tradition of record keeping, of centralized administration, therefore, just like the Mongols, all these other societies, once they had conquered sedentary societies, essentially had to adopt their own tradition of rule, had to adopt the same type of tradition of administration, the same type of tradition of record keeping and so on as the people that they had overthrown. So in all of these other cases, we see where dynasties that originated within the nomadic tradition essentially adopt the tradition of a sedentary state upon conquering that region. And in fact, if we look throughout history, we see a pattern here of where nomads and nomadic forces will conquer a state, and then over a course of one or two generations, will adopt the habits, the practices of that sedentary state, will essentially assimilate to the traditions of that state, will become sedentarized themselves, and then over 50 or 100 years later will then themselves be overthrown by a new group of nomads who will then replace that process. This is was the foundation of a very famous study by a 15th century Egyptian historian by the name of Ibn Khaldun, who first laid out this cyclical view of state power, of nomads conquering sedentary societies, themselves sedentarizing, and then setting themselves up to be conquered by new nomadic forces who had that much greater degree of military power that came from being a nomadic society. So the real question then is not, it's not necessarily interesting the fact that the Kazakhs are nomads. What is an interesting question is, why did the Kazakhs remain nomads at a time when so many other formerly nomadic societies were sedentarizing at this place? So why did the Ottoman Turks sedentarize but the Kazakhs did not? Why did the Safavids, the Mughals, the Qing, why did they choose a process of sedentarization but not the Kazakhs? And here, again, I think we have to look at this question of environment. So let me turn to that argument now. So if we look at a map of Eurasia, as I have displayed here, this is a physical map of the world, not a political map. It is a map with the modern-day political boundaries removed. And oftentimes it can be very useful to look at maps without the present-day political boundaries, which often can obscure more than they actually enlighten when we think about the underlying factors that drive the development of politics. And so if we look at this map of Eurasia, if we look at the territories surrounding the Kazakh steppe, especially those to the south and to the west and the east of the Kazakh steppe, or of present-day Kazakhstan, we notice that many of these are marked as brown on this map here, meaning that they are dry. This is a great expanse of territory often referred to as the Eurasian Arid Zone, basically a large band of dry desert-like territory extending all the way from Morocco, the western part of northern Africa in the west, all the way through to the across Central Asia to the Gobi Desert in present-day China. And when we look historically at the places within this territory where states have formed, they have generally been in areas where water is available and in areas of land interspersed throughout these dry areas where agriculture could be developed. So the most famous of these being the territory of Mesopotamia and modern day Iraq in the Middle East. Further to the west along the Nile River, along the lower Nile River, where we find a very early process of state formation in Egypt. Further to the east, in the region of the Punjab along the Indus River in the Indian subcontinent, again, we see a very early process of state formation in what is known as the Indus Valley civilization that occurred there. If we look closer to home here and a map more closely of Central Asia, a physical map of Central Asia, again, we see a very clear distinction here between the steppe region and a very dry region to the south, which is interspersed by oases of areas predominantly along the Amudarya and Sirdarya rivers, where we see the earliest processes of urbanization, of urban development, and state formation. So very famous cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Tashkent, cities in present-day southern Kazakhstan, like Turkestan, for example, Almaty, that have this that are centered around these oases along the rivers. Now, if we historically look at the type of states that have emerged around these oasis territories, they often tend to be very much more centralized states than what we find within the steppe. And the reason for this, I would argue, is because of the type of economic system that emerges out of this. Again, these are states that are based predominantly on agriculture. And agriculture is a fixed commodity. What I mean by this is that it is literally rooted in the ground. Those who control that area of agricultural production are the ones who have control over the local economy, who can extract taxation from it. And if you are a farmer who is tilling the soil in one of these regions, you basically have very little choice but to submit to the authority of whoever is ruling over you at that time. And this is very different from what we see in the steppe region to the north. Of course, it's interesting, Kazakhstan today is a major exporter of grain. But historically, this was not the case. Historically, the soil in the steppe region was, for the most part, very poorly suited to agriculture. It was a rather thin layer of soil that simply did not support large-scale agriculture until the 20th century, when we see the introduction of new technologies of irrigation, of fertilizers and whatnot that have allowed the flourishing of agriculture within Kazakhstan today. But previously, that was not the case. It's a reason why we do not see the formation of centralized states based around the extraction of taxes from agriculture within the steppe. What the steppe is very good for, as you know, is nomadism. It supports grass, essentially. It is the main type of crop, we might say, that historically has grown within the steppe. And the basis of a nomadic economy, of course, is mobile. It is based on animals, and animals have feet on them, which means that if you are a nomad, if your wealth is based in herds, you have a lot more options available to you in terms of your political choices. If you do not like who your Khan is, if you do not like who your ruler is, you can get up and move. You can take your herds with you and go somewhere else. This is the reason why historically centralized states like Russia, like China, like the Persian Empire have been very uncomfortable about having nomads on their borders, because nomads are very difficult to tax because they keep moving around. Nomads have a tendency to conduct raids upon sedentary communities. So states historically around the Eurasian steppe throughout history have tried to pursue measures either to convince the nomads to sedentarize, which generally to very little effect, or to find some way of keeping them out, of keeping them at bay. In China, this meant the development of literal walls, of the Great Wall of China, or we should say the Great Walls of China, because they were actually built many different walls at different times in history, that were built essentially to keep nomads out, to protect the sedentary communities within China from the nomadic peoples on the steppe. So it's a reason why states based on sedentary agriculture are historically have been very uncomfortable, very unfriendly towards nomads because of this fact that they are very hard to control. And it is the reason why, when we look at politics among nomads, politics tends to be very decentralized. Part of the reason why we have, as we have seen in our previous lectures, why the type of political system among the post-Mongol states, and particularly among the Kazakhs, as we have seen, was much more democratic. Basically, the common people and the representatives of the common people had a lot more say in choosing the Han. And if you want to be Han, it's not enough to just simply say, I'm the Han, you must pay your taxes to me. No, you had to negotiate with people. You had to somehow prove your merit or your worth of being Han. And you had to share resources with them. You could not simply collect taxes and accumulate wealth endlessly. You had to share your resources with them, because if you do not, guess what? They're going to pick someone else's Han. And they can do that, again, because the source of wealth is mobile. Again, it literally has feet attached to it. It can get up and move. Whereas if you are a farmer, say in a place like Persia or China, you cannot just simply pick up your crops and move them very easily. The options available to you in terms of your political choices are much more limited. So what we see among the nomads of the Dashti Kipchak, later among the Kazakh steppe, is a much greater degree of political freedom, again, that emerges from their environment, that emerges from the type of economic system that we see among nomads, again, which gives states, people looking to control nomads, a much more limited array of options in terms of extracting taxes, in terms of extracting resources from them. Which meant it simply became much more difficult to develop centralized states within the steppe than in neighboring societies where we have much more agriculturally based economies. So I want to think a little more closely about how this might change or impact the way that we think about politics within the Qazaq Khanate. And I want to pose a more fundamental question here. Throughout these lectures, we've been talking about something called the Qazaq Khanate, assuming that this was one singular entity, um, sort of posing it as another variation on the type of states that we see throughout the rest of the world in this period. But was this really the case? Now, one way of thinking about this is by looking at the presentation of history that we find in the sources from this period, in terms of what the sources tell us about who was Han and when certain Hans ruled. Now, this is a very tricky question because, as I have mentioned in a previous lecture, when we think about the sources that we find that give us information about the history of the Kazakhs in this period, nearly all of them are being written by people who are not actually Kazakhs themselves. In most cases, people who themselves are not actually nomads. They're being written within neighboring societies like the Ottoman Empire, like the Persian Empire, like among the Russians or the Chinese, who are members of sedentary centralized states and who have, accordingly, certain assumptions about how politics ought to work. And is it possible that these sort of assumptions color the way that they talk about the history of the Kazakhs? Now, one example of this is if we look at the presentation of the history of Kazakhstan and history of the Qazaq Khanate according to Wikipedia, a very popular source of history for many students today, but not one that I would recommend you use, at least not for this class. And if you look at the history of the Qazaq Khanate on Wikipedia, you will see a very neat, a very orderly presentation of succession here, of one Han succeeding the other. There's no overlap between their Khanates. It is very similar to if you were for example, to look at the list of the rulers of Russia or the rulers of China or the list of presidents of the United States of America, where you see a nice orderly pattern of succession, um, clearly something that is what one would expect to see in a more centralized state elsewhere in this period or today. But for the history of the Qazaq Khanate, in fact, is complete nonsense, if I might be frank. This simply is not an accurate portrayal of the history of the Qazaq Khanate. And why? Well, let's look at a couple examples. Let's start with this figure of Boydash Khan, someone who shows up in your readings from the Tariq al-Rashidi for this week. Now, according to the Tariq al-Rashidi, Boydash Khan, in fact, might have died in 1534. As you'll see from the text, it's not actually clear if the text is saying if he died or if he perhaps just went away somewhere. Many historians have assumed, in fact, that he died, and the reasons they make this assumption is because other sources refer to other people being Han after 1534. In particular, the figure of Tawakkul Khan is shown as being Han in some sources already from the mid 1550s. However, there are other sources from the same period that refer to Boydash Khan as being alive as late as 1560. So how is it possible that Boydash Khan was still alive in 1560 when Tawakkul Khan was, we know, already ruling from 1550s? We can't possibly have two people claiming the position of Han at the same time. That would lead to civil war, right? Well, in fact, other sources point to another figure who is said to have been ruling as Han throughout this period as well, the figure of Haknazar, who is said to have been one of the most powerful Hans of the Kazakhs in the 16th century, who many sources say began ruling as Han as early as 1538. So this brings up a question. How can we have three different people being Han at one time? Is it simply a mistake in the sources? Did they get their dates wrong? A lot of historians of modern day secondary sources have tried to claim exactly this. This is simply a mistake, that these figures could not have been Hans at one time, because having multiple Hans would mean civil war, right? We can't have two Shahs of Persia at the same time. We can't have two Tsars of Russia at the same time. Nor can we have two Hans among the Kazakhs at the same time. Or can we? Perhaps there's something else going on here. One explanation might be simply that this is a reflection of the three Juz system that we do see emerging later among the Kazakhs. But there's simply no evidence that we have a system of Juzes in place in the 16th century. As I mentioned in my previous lecture, all the evidence points to this being a development that emerged sometime in the mid 17th century. So that's not really a very good explanation either. Um, Perhaps we need to think differently about the nature of politics within the Qazaq Khanate. And so I would like to suggest here a different model by which we might be able to think about the nature of politics within the Kazakh steppe. As it was clear that the Kazakh polity was simply not that of the same model of an absolute monarchy or centralized state as we see in other areas of the world in this period. Rather, perhaps we could suggest that leadership was exercised at a collective level within the ruling family, in a model in which you could potentially have multiple people claiming the position of Han in different areas of the steppe at the same time, where we have a practice of political accommodation between various people who are exercising authority over different areas of the steppe. As we know, the Kazakh polity from the very beginning was a dual Khanate. We see both Giray and Janibek Khan at the same time exercising the position of Khanship. And we don't see any evidence that they were fighting with each other over this. There's no evidence of a civil war among the Kazakhs in the 15th century. Rather, it seems that both of them were willing to accommodate one another, to recognize each other as Han, and to exercise that authority among the followers of the Kazakhs at a collective level. So again, a very different model of leadership than what we see among other states in this period, which have a much more centralized sort of model. And of course, the reason why we are able to see this type of model among the Kazakhs, I would argue, is because of the nature of their economic system, which itself is a reflection of their ecological niche, of their natural environment, which is one that is very well suited towards pastoral nomadism, but not large-scale agriculture, which is what facilitates the development of more centralized states. And because of this different sort of economic system, ordinary Kazakhs simply had a much greater degree of political choice, of political freedom, a greater degree of say in who they will follow as Han. And so this had a great number of implications for both the type of economic and political system that we see emerging on the Kazakh steppe. Now, these factors did eventually contribute to the division and the emergence of the three Juzes among the Kazakhs. Again, this is a development that we see most likely in the early to mid 17th century. There simply is not evidence for it occurring earlier. But we can imagine how the type of processes we have been examining here in earlier lectures did eventually lead up to a more formal division of authority among the Kazakhs, a more territorial-based division that we see among the three hordes, among the three Juzes that developed in the 17th century. One question I want to leave you with here to think about in your seminar and also in future seminars is what are the strengths and the weaknesses of such a system? Um, are there things that may have made the system more susceptible to weaknesses, more susceptible perhaps to conquering by outside powers than if Kazakhs had had a more centralized system? For example, the Djungar tax that began in the 17th century and which reached their peak in the early 18th century, something that we will explore further in a future lecture. Would the Kazakhs have necessarily been more successful in defending against the Djungars if they had a more centralized state? Your most immediate instinct may be to say, well, of course they would. If they had been more centralized, then they could have been more united and been more successful in repelling the Djungars. One of the things you will learn in that lecture is, in fact, the Djungars did have a more centralized state. They had, even though they began as a nomadic community, they in fact developed many of the features that we see of gunpowder empire states in this period, of a more centralized bureaucracy, of the development of gunpowder, of a more centralized political system. Where are the Djungars on the map today? Why is there no state called Djungaristan on the map today? And why is there a state called Kazakhstan? If it's so preferable to have a centralized state, then why were the Djungars wiped out eventually by the Chinese? And why did the Kazakhs survive? It's an interesting question and one we can think about more in future seminars. So I will leave you with some considerations here for future discussion. But again, I want you, as you proceed through your seminars in this and in future weeks, I want you to think about how these differences among the Kazakhs may have contributed to the very unique type of political system we see among the Kazakhs in this period, and also to think seriously about what may have been not only the weaknesses of this system that are often discussed, but what may have been the strengths or the benefits to this type of more decentralized system as well. Thank you.